Financing these plants is a challenge facing the electric power sector as it seeks to develop and deploy the low-carbon and zero-carbon technologies necessary to reduce and eliminate greenhouse gas emissions. As lawmakers write environmental legislation and policy to include targets and timetables for carbon reduction, they absolutely have to help provide the technology and the means to achieve those targets and timetables. In my view, that will require an aggressive program of financing support, much more aggressive and ambitious than anything in place today. For new nuclear plant construction, one of the most significant financing challenges is the cost of these projects relative to the size, the market value, and the financing capacity of the utility companies that will build them. New nuclear reactors are expected to cost at least $6 to $7 billion in today's dollars, 2008 dollars. U.S. electric power companies generally do not have the economic strength to finance that size project on their corporate balance sheet on their own, particularly at a time when they're investing very heavily in other generating capacity and transmission and distribution infrastructure and environmental controls. Those first projects must have financing support, either loan guarantees from the federal government at no expense to the taxpayer that would provide access to capital at acceptable and more competitive rates, or assurance of investment recovery from state governments, or perhaps both. The loan guarantee program authorized by Congress and signed into law by President Bush in the 2005 Energy Policy Act was certainly a step in the right direction, but the good intentions have nearly been gutted through tinkering by the executive branch officials and some in Congress, especially as artificially constrained by the House Appropriations Committee. This loan guarantee program does not represent a sufficient response to the urgent need to rebuild our critical electric power infrastructure, about a $1 trillion undertaking over the next 20 years. Limits imposed by the House appropriators have resulted in a loan guarantee cap that will not begin to cover the project cost, and also imposition of time limits, year-by-year authorization, that have introduced additional unnecessary uncertainty into the process for nuclear and nuclear's clean energy partners, solar and wind projects. I believe that the United States will need something similar to the Clean Energy Bank concept now under consideration by more thoughtful members of Congress. A government corporation modeled on the Export-Import Bank and the Overseas Private Investment Corporation to provide loan guarantees and other forms of financing support to ensure that capital flows to clean technology development in the electric sector. The Export-Import Bank has $100 billion of loan guarantee authority to support American companies doing business overseas. The irony is that if First Energy wanted to build a nuclear power plant overseas, they could go to the Export-Import Bank and receive exactly the kind of backing that I'm asking for to be able to build these nuclear power plants and solar plants and wind plants in our own country. And oh, by the way, the Export-Import Bank returns money to the Treasury each year. It is not a drain on taxpayer resources. Additionally, the federal government already manages, in addition to the Export-Import Bank, an extremely successful total loan guarantee portfolio of approximately $1.1 trillion, which, again, on average, returns more to the Treasury in dollars than it costs the taxpayer, and returns significantly more in social value than any taxpayer cost. We, in fact, in this country use loan guarantee programs to support student loans, to support affordable housing, to support construction of critical transportation infrastructure, shipbuilding, steel making, rural electrification, and for many other purposes. Well, America's electric infrastructure surely is just as important. While the United States electric industry represents only 3 to 4% of total GDP in this country, the other 96 to 97% of our $13 trillion economy has a critical dependence on that 3 to 4% of electricity. I have addressed some of the challenges facing the future nuclear power industry in this country and the construction of new plants. Allow me now to talk just a little bit about our existing nuclear power plants and their operations in just this last year, 2007. The 104 commercial reactors operating in our 31 states around this country provided an all-time record high electricity production. U.S. nuclear plants generated nearly 20% of U.S. electricity last year, with only 10% of installed capacity for our United States grid. Now, how on earth do you get 20% of production with only 10% of installed capacity? I think I've already provided a hint to that answer, and it is that nuclear power plants operate nearly all the time, 24/7 at full power. Coal plants operate at about 70% capacity, natural gas at about 40%, wind and hydro operate as they can at 30%, and solar, when the sun is shining, at about 20% of full capacity. Technically, this measure is called capacity factor. Nuclear plants achieved a record-setting average capacity factor of 92% in 2007. This performance reflects excellence in plant management of operations and maintenance and an industry-wide commitment to safety. This highly efficient output drives superior economic performance. Nuclear electricity production cost last year was 1.76 cents a kilowatt hour. I'd like to be paying that on my electric bill. A record low, cheaper than coal, 1/4 the cost of electricity using natural gas. Nuclear production costs are stable and not subject to fluctuation like the natural gas or oil markets. And let me mention once again the clean air benefits. I've already said nuclear energy is our country's only large-scale electricity source capable of producing baseload electricity 24/7 while emitting no greenhouse gases during production. Our 104 nuclear power plants in this country generate, in fact, 74% of all greenhouse gas emission-free electricity. Nuclear plants, in fact, avoid carbon dioxide emissions equivalent to all the cars on the roads in this country. These record accomplishments of America's nuclear power plants are more than simply impressive statistics of electricity generation. These operating plants and their records represent a solid platform from which to launch the next nuclear power build cycle. Most importantly, these record-breaking statistics are a true indicator of an industry that does hold safety as its highest priority. I want to address now very quickly 3 of the often reported concerns about nuclear energy that may trouble some of you. Used reactor fuel management. Some call it waste. Second, cost, overall cost of these plants. And then third, the adequacy of the supply chain to support this sort of build rate that I've been talking about. First, let me report to you that the mood in our country has fundamentally shifted from one of being skeptical of nuclear energy to one of supporting nuclear energy. You're not supposed to do this, but if you would amalgamate all the questions that get asked on all the polls into simply one question and all the polls that get taken into one poll, the overall support level for nuclear is around 62%. And interestingly, there's a reverse NIMBY involved in this. The closer one gets to existing nuclear power plants, the higher that support rating goes. It goes from 62% to 82% on average as you move within the 10-mile area around existing plants. And this support represents a strong bipartisan support in the federal, state, and local governments. But this is not always unqualified support. In my travels around the country and my discussions with groups like this City Club, I find that many people are disposed to accept nuclear energy but have lingering reservations. I call these the yes buts. Yes, nuclear clearly has to be on the table, but what about waste? What about the cost? What about the supply chain? So first, let me talk about the used fuel, if I may, for just a second.